For those of you who work maybe at an agency or have like a front desk staff, make sure you also address that as well, because if somebody is coming in to see you and you could be great at all of this, but they're misgendered in the waiting room or by somebody on staff, then they already are going to get an impression about that. Mm-hmm. And then once they're in the room with you, there's getting in the practice of introducing yourself with your pronouns is something that can be really helpful. And again, the more you do it outside of session, the easier it'll become. And I don't know if you'll have like a phone consultation with them beforehand or in person, but just jumping right in and saying, the way I do it, usually, hi, I'm Dara. You say them pronouns, and then just easy breezy. You're just adding it on, just as if it's just the most normal thing in the world that we just add that on.
Welcome to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. This episode is sponsored by the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. Hi, I'm Janine Wolf, and I'm your colleague down the hall. I have a passion for helping fellow therapists get the clinical and collegial support we all need to do this work. And wow, it just keeps getting harder every day. I'm the founder and facilitator of the Collab Oasis Clinical Consultation Groups. I have been a social worker for almost 30 years, and I own a successful solo online private practice. More of us than ever are practicing in solo or online practices, and we all need colleagues to process cases with, commiserate with on those really hard days, and also to celebrate our successes with. In this podcast, I'll bring you insights about trends and changes in our field and sit down with amazing therapists who are doing amazing work. We'll discuss fictionalized cases, ways to practice sustainably, and of course, there will be plenty of laughing. I love laughing with friends. I'm so glad to have you as one of my colleagues down the hall. Hello, everyone. You are listening to another episode of the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. I'm your host, Janine Wolf, and today I am joined by Dara Hoffman. Dara, whose pronouns are they, them, is a non-binary, queer-identified licensed professional counselor in Colorado Springs, Colorado. Dara has 18 years of experience serving the trans and non-binary community. As the author of You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery, Dara has been recognized nationally as an expert trainer and presenter, sharing their knowledge with organizations, businesses, and conferences across the country. So today we're going to talk about working with LGBTQ clients and ways to promote inclusivity and safety with this population. Welcome, Dara.
Hi, thanks for having me on your show.
Yes, absolutely. We actually had a little pre-chat before this, and it was a lot of fun. So I think this is going to be a really good episode for our listeners.
I agree.
So to kick us off, those in the LGBTQ community often have a history of being misgendered, having others not use their chosen name, and other forms of microaggressions and trauma. Can you discuss some of those to get us started?
Sure. What would you like to start with?
Well, so what are the most common types of microaggressions and trauma that you would say people need to be aware of when working with this population of clients?
Sure. Well, you mentioned right away about misgendering. So we can kind of even back up a second. Is something right from the start to think about yourself as a clinician is what are you putting out there in terms of gathering information from your clients? And so hopefully there is somewhere on your paperwork where you are already asking about if they have a name different than their legal name and what their pronouns are. And then even some questions that do have to do with identifying their gender, or if that's an issue that they want to talk about. Now, the thing is that not everybody is going to be ready to talk right away about it. So you're just kind of setting the stage. But make sure this is something that you take a look at, because it could be the person you see either on your screen or in person. Your brain might not match up with what you have seen. Let's say, oh, this is a person who hasn't transitioned yet. This is the pronouns they're using. Wait, my brain thinks they're a different gender. You have to make sure you can do that ahead of time, just to make sure you're like, okay, this is the name of the person, this is the pronouns they're using. But as you're getting to know a client and you have your experiences together, it sounds like a really small thing, but making sure you're using that correct name and pronouns. Along with pronouns, it also has to do with gendered language. And so you're working with somebody who's non-binary, you're having to watch and make sure you're using gender neutral language. And once you start paying attention to language and how much it is gendered, you will be astounded by how often it is used, where we use he or she in a pronoun, or just words that are gendered. And so using, even if you're talking about a person about them in the past, and you this is a person who, let's say, is a trans man or is a non-binary person, and you refer to them by the gender they were assigned at birth, but they no longer identify with, but you say, oh, like when you were a little girl, that can completely derail the entire session. And so that's a huge, like you said, about when it comes to microaggressions, I would say so we lumped a lot of things into one thing: name, pronouns, and also just gendered language.
When people are starting to have an awareness around this population and wanting to do things right, there's so much fear around getting it wrong, I think, for people who are open to this, saying, these people are out there, I want to work with them. Or we as therapists know, people are complex. So we have clients that come to us for a specialty, but they have so many different aspects of who they are, that whether or not this is the population you choose to work with, you are going to be encountering some of these clients.
Yeah, that's a really great point. I was thinking about that before we talked, because I did a training on Friday. I co-facilitated a training. In large part, we talked a lot about to clinicians working with trans clients, and the fear part. Like that is, even just in the training itself, talking to us, both myself and my co-facilitator are non-binary, and just like not wanting to mess up, not wanting to say the wrong thing. And I know I totally get that, because there is a lot to know, there is a lot to learn, but honing in on those basics, like you said, what are those few things that you can do to make sure, even as somebody who happens to have a client who has this in your area of specialty, but they happen to be trans. It is this dance between getting to know your client as an individual, which that's what you do anyway. But
right.
So you're getting to know them as a trans individual. And so there are questions, of course, you're going to ask them. And then there's certain questions that I guess we would just say, well, you, as a clinician, you probably could Google that instead. That's too general of a question. That's something that you need to go ahead and follow up on. And it's okay to let your client know that you're going to do that, but never putting the onus on them to answer those questions. And then going forward, as you're working with somebody, just keeping in mind that you don't also have to hyper focus on the fact that they are trans, unless you need to also keep in mind that, yes, they do have this as a part of their life. Here's the things that can be stressful, challenging about that. And even knowing, like, when you were young, you didn't know this about yourself. So there's identity formation things to keep in mind. So again, that balance between remembering this is what's happening with this person, but not bringing it up even more than they want it actually brought up.
Okay. And then also, we're going to make mistakes. So I guess 2 questions. One is, how do you kindly or politely recover? And how can you let your clients know, if I make a mistake, please let me know, or don't let me know? What are the ways to handle that?
Yeah. Great question. One of the top questions.
Okay.
I would say, to start with, again, remember yourself as a therapist, remember your strengths. And a lot of therapists, we have the ability to sense when something maybe has gone awry in a session. And, you sense that distance, or there's, if there's different looking down, and whereas they were looking in the eye before. So just as always, pay attention if there's a shift in the room. It's very possible. It could have been several things, and it could have been that you accidentally caused a microaggression. And again, that would be, if for those who aren't aware of microaggression, it is known as like having 1,000 tiny paper cuts. So it's like you go about your day, like I said, I'm non-binary, and the number of times that, let's say, I get misgendered during the day as ma'am, ladies, she, it's like having the same little paper cut, but it happens right in the same spot over and over again. By the end of the day, you're like, ow, that hurt. And so that's where you actually accidentally do that with a client. So for one, do what you would always do in a situation like that. And you can pause and just say, I'm noticing there was a little change in the energy, or is, can I check in? And just do it, like you said, just gently, just like you always would. If it does have something to do with their gender, and let's say they let you know as well in that situation. I know for me, when I've been in that situation with other marginalized groups where I've made that mistake, I have an internal response. I might blush, I might feel shame, embarrassment, all those things. So just like you would in any other situation, keep that, keep grounded, stay present. Don't make it about putting it on your client. Like, the worst thing you could do is like, oh my gosh, I'm so sorry, I didn't mean to do it. And you just go on about your own feelings about how much you wish you hadn't done that, that then completely derails it. It is important to bring recognition to that moment, and like you said, to check in, but making sure that you take the time after the session to process for yourself, like, why did that happen? Is there something else I need to learn? Do I need to seek consultation? But with the client themselves, if you know them for a while, then you probably would know how you can navigate that situation with them. So you might be like, we might just have to talk about this the rest of the session. That's okay. It might be like, okay, I need to definitely make sure at the beginning of our next session to check in about that, especially if it feels like there is something that's still off about that.
Yeah, there's so much changing terminology and awareness. I feel like it's happening more maybe in the therapist field than the general population. Well, I don't guess that. I know that. And so I think that can be really intimidating. Like, we want to be open and respectful and affirming. That fear is a big thing in the room. And as you were talking, I was thinking we really need to be aware of countertransference and not feeling defensive if someone is letting us know that we've gotten it wrong. It's not about us. It's about the client and how we can help them in that moment.
Yeah, exactly. And every client is different. You're going to, the way that they react with you potentially is the way they react out in the world when this is happening. And it could be different at different stages of where they're at. They could be brand new to coming out and using their new pronouns and all that. And it could really hurt every time something doesn't go well. And it could be very different for someone who's already been out for 10 years. And they might say like, they might just stop you and say like, oh, you forgot. And maybe they even have a playful way of doing it or a relaxed way of doing it. But might as well, like you said, we might as well talk about what it might be like when it can feel like it can be very disruptive to the client therapist connection. And so again, tuning into like what you already know to be your strengths as a therapist, use those same skills with this client as you would with anyone else. But because it is something where you have misspoke, then being able to, again, in that moment, recognize that, okay, there's some education I need to get on that. Or even if it was like, I can't believe I did that. I just was really tired today. Don't let the client know that. Just let them know that you recognize that happened, and ask like, if, would you like to pause for a bit? Would you like to spend some time on this? Because I am here for that. But one thing I think is a really good tip is, instead of saying I'm sorry, is to say, thank you for letting me know.
Okay.
And that's something you can, and the other great tip is like, make sure you practice this in your life, not just with your one trans client. This, because you never know who's going to pop up in your life, first of all, who might be going through this. But the more you can practice this using gender neutral language, and if you do know anybody who's, in terms of their pronouns and name, like, just practice the heck out of it, so that your brain actually does need to reprogram. I mean, even though I'm non-binary, I still have a brain that was, I didn't realize I was non-binary until I was 40. So that's a lot of years that I didn't do this right as well. We're all learning. Like you said, we're all learning as we go along.
Yeah. And that sort of paying attention and self-reflection, even I've found myself doing that so much more in the last 5 or 6 years, just like when I'm being exposed to any type of media, news or TV shows or social media, and following along in my head, like, okay, noticing that someone said that and practicing saying it in my head, so that it comes more of like this, it's a more common experience, instead of, like you said, you've got that one transgender client and you're like all nervous about, I haven't practiced, what's going to happen.
Yes, exactly. That's a really good idea. So yeah, just like you said, you could do that while you're taking in media, make notes to yourself just to keep practicing that. It's going to be a benefit to so many people in so many ways. And hopefully it'll make you feel good as a person too, to be doing that.
Yeah. Yeah. And overall, I think it's good to just create an awareness around differences in general. And, it gets a lot easier. I find the more that I've exposed myself to different populations of clients or people who have very different lives than myself, I grow so much from it. And so I hope therapists can have that as a takeaway as well, that's one of the best parts of our job. We get to grow as people every time we work with a client who brings something new to the table.
That's a great point. I've heard a lot of people say once they open themselves up to working with trans clients, it's such it's like it happened to me too as a therapist. It's such an honor to be a part of that big of a experience that someone's having. And I thought I'd mention too, there are more youth that are aware that this exists now. So for those of you who do work with youth, I wouldn't be surprised if you're like, yes, I already do have clients who are going through this. And, I'll be the first to admit there is terminology that they catch on to before I do. And,
Yes.
being humbled in that experience to understand what's going on with that. And there's a lot of wisdom and knowledge that can come from them as well, because there is a lot out there to be experienced, but also you have to kind of walk that line with them where sometimes there could be a bit too much information and it can blur the lines. So working with youth is, in particular, I would say, if that's something you want to do on a regular basis, then that would require a bit more education and experience to be able to navigate that. I see that in particular because also you're dealing with parents, caregivers who are part of that person's life as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And my earlier experiences with just wanting to create some more awareness for myself and make sure that I was being safe and inclusive was having parents come to me saying, okay, my child is 12 and they've just come out and they want me to call them this different name and they're dressing differently. And, so for me, navigating like how to support them on their journey with that and hopefully help them not create harm to their child in that process.
Yes. Again, like you just said, you might not have a direct client who's trans, but and you're working with the parent of somebody who is, because a lot of times therapists who are seeing the kid are like, you make sure you go see a therapist as well as the parent and being able to provide that support. Or you could just have an adult client who has a trans kid and they're going to pick up on if you are, what your paperwork work looks like. What does your website show? Do you have your pronouns listed in your email signature and things like that?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So those are some really early on ways when clients are first becoming familiar with you. That intake paperwork where you're asking those questions, your website being inclusive. Those are ways that we can demonstrate that we are being inclusive. What are some ways that we've discussed this a little bit, but are there specific things you can guide us on that we haven't talked about so far, but creating a sense of safety in the room with clients?
Sure. Thank you again for bringing up that you can create that safety even before you are in space together. And for those of you who work maybe at an agency or have like a front desk staff, make sure you also address that as well, because if somebody is coming in to see you and you could be great at all of this, but they're misgendered in the waiting room or by somebody on staff, then they already are going to get an impression about that.
Mm-hmm.
And then once they're in the room with you, there's getting in the practice of introducing yourself with your pronouns is something that can be really helpful. And again, the more you do it outside of session, the easier it'll become. And I don't know if you'll have like a phone consultation with them beforehand or in person, but just jumping right in and saying, the way I do it, usually, hi, I'm Dara. You say them pronouns. And then just easy breezy. You're just adding it on just as if it's just the most normal thing in the world that we just add that on. So you're setting a stage by doing that. And, you can have things that you want to have displayed in your office. If it is just even just one trans flag or LGBTQ flag, something like that, that shows that you are an ally as well. Other than that, it really is about like that space that you hold in the room with them and just keeping really cognizant. Like I said, even just like gender neutral language. Oh, another good thing is to know in your building what's going on with your restrooms, because this is something that a lot of people who are trans, first thing that they need to check out is seeing like, what's the bathroom situation here? Because am I going to be able to use the bathroom or not in this building that I'm in? Sometimes that might be out of your hands, but a few things to keep in mind is if you do have gendered restrooms, I don't know if you have a landlord or whoever's in charge that you could ask like, hey, I have a thing, and I wondered if we could work on this together. I have heard stories where people have been able to have success with that. I had success with my landlord about that because it was just a single restroom and it just said, and it was just silly that it didn't have gender neutral on it. And so from there, if there really is no way you can change it, make sure you bring this to the attention of the client and you ask them, what is it that would help you feel most safe when it comes to if you need to use the restroom? Are you okay on your own? I'm happy to go with you to be able to, or is there another option, even if it's somewhere else in the building, which can feel, you don't want them to feel like they're being othered by having to say, oh, it's in the basement. Like this is one, this is the video where it's like the teachers use it there. But being able to say that you're aware that this is a problem, but you're here to support them, that can go a long way as well.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So we're thinking about clients who are not necessarily, they're seeing you for a specialty that is separate from that. And so as one example, and so following the lead of the client kind of feels like what this has all been sort of heading to. Like if they've come to you about this certain specialization, you're not going to ignore all this, but you're not also going to every single day like start with that, right?
Yes, exactly. And again, it's something that I remember when I was in graduate school, they were showing us videos about like, what's the right way, wrong way to do it. And it was just like a really over the top video of a therapist, really genuine and wanting to help, just being like, the client was a woman. She was like, yes, like I just, my partner and I have been having some troubles and their oldest kid just moved in again. And it's just been really stressful. And the therapist would just be like, so being gay is really hard, isn't it? And she's just like, sometimes, but anyway. And then like the therapist was just like, oh, I just feel that like the oppression is a part of this. And just like, so you are keeping things in mind, silently to yourself, being what is culturally relevant, displaying cultural humility, which is different than being competent. Competent is a word that we have heard a lot in the past in terms of as therapists, make sure you're competent working with this population. And that has a lot to do with skills and knowledge and what's in your brain in terms of what you know. But being culturally humble means you're going to be evaluating yourself. And how are you doing when it comes to like taking in the experience of this other person? How are your identities playing out in the room with one another? And this applies to any community that you're not a part of. And so being able to navigate that space with that client, you do want to keep in mind that yes, there is oppression. Yes, there is, marginalized stress. And is this client talking about that today? Maybe not. Now, thinking about the climate, for instance, political climate, maybe these clients might be more stressed for a good reason as certain elections start coming up. Maybe if there is a mass shooting at a gay bar, it is okay to check in with your client very specifically if they are LGBTQ and trans and say, I heard about this tragedy. How are you today? Or anything that could be related to something that could be relevant in that way. Because I have heard on the flip side that some clients were really sad when their therapist didn't check in with them about and even checking in between sessions when something that big happens can really show that you don't forget that they are a part of this marginalized community.
Yeah, and I would love to hear your thoughts on, over the past 5 years, there's been so many tragic events happening to people with all different type of marginalized populations. And after George Floyd had been murdered, I was very intentional in, okay, I want to check in with my Black clients and see how they're doing. And then I was like, this is like a nationwide thing and it's really creating a lot in our world. So should I be checking in with just those clients or should I be checking in with every client and saying, hey, this big thing just happened in the world. Is that something you want to discuss today? What are your thoughts about that?
Yeah. And again, it could be different from client to client. Some clients you work with might actually really not want to talk about that. Just kind of thinking back on But from what you know of these clients, especially if you have been working with them for a while, my guess is that you would know, like, is this something that more than likely would be in their hearts and on their minds when they come in? And you can wait until the actual session so that you can they might bring it up on their own. My guess is that if they don't bring it up on their own, then perhaps they are aware it happened and maybe they have their feelings to process, but it's not the predominant thing they want to talk about that day. But I would say be prepared just in case to be able to have those kinds of check-ins. And you yourself might be impacted by what happened as well. And so, and it's okay to what extent you're comfortable showing up as your authentic self, in those moments when that has happened. So that's good to keep in mind as well.
Yeah. We hold so many different things as therapists. And one aspect that I've been looking at more and more, especially with the therapists in my consultation groups, is our own capacity when big things happen in the world. And I got some criticism a couple of years ago because something really big happened. And it was the end of 1 week. And so I canceled the first couple of days of the next week because I needed time to get myself right. I was being told, like, how dare you do that to your clients? They need you. That's not okay. And I'm like, but I'm a person who's dealing with stuff too. What are your thoughts about that?
Oh, well, first of all, I'm sorry that happened to you because I feel very strongly that I agree that there is something to that. And I guess that's just the kind of therapist I am as well, is that, we want our clients to feel, or authenticness and our humanness. And so coming to session when something like this happened, when we know it could actually be a distraction, and especially if it could end up accidentally burdening that client, I think that actually is the opposite, where we're actually not just taking care of ourselves, but our clients as well in those moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I think this goes back to, we set the bar so high for ourselves as therapists that we feel like we have to show up no matter what. Something that we talk about a lot is how sick is too sick to see clients. And I'm like, well, if you're asking the question, you're too sick, so don't see them. Right?
Yes.
Lots of those nuances of our humanness as therapists.
Right. And I mean, I guess I know the classic example is at this point when we were going through the pandemic, and just how for me personally, I did close my practice about 2.5 years ago. And I did experience incredible burnout during COVID, and working with clients and not being able to, you can't really leave it though. We're all just going through it together. So hopefully nothing like that extreme happens again for us as therapists. But like, wow, for those of you who still are like feeling like you're still recovering from that, I feel you. And it is okay that still almost kind of like maybe haunts us in a sense, to know that, wow, like this is something where we are humans showing up in this space for other people. But what do I need to do to make sure that I don't lose my sense of self in this process?
Mm-hmm. That's such a great point about the pandemic. I feel like we sort of talk about it like it's in the past, but there's still so many ways that we are trying to readjust as a society. And so societal norms around masking and all kinds of different things out there. So I agree. And then we do know that there were certain populations that were affected in lots of different ways, and remembering that awareness too, because maybe you feel like you've moved on from the pandemic, but that doesn't mean your clients have.
Oh, great point. Exactly.
So we were talking about the office space earlier. What are ways that you can support coworkers who are LGBTQ in the office setting?
Sure. Let's see. That's a great question. Well, for one, again, same thing about honoring their name and pronouns. And it could be something where they're in the midst of transition. You just really model it for others.
Okay.
And you can do that in your personal life too. Like I said, just practice it. Like if you're seeing somebody continuing to misgender someone, and even if you're like, okay, that person just needs some more time, they're not being malicious, then showing. So this happened to me yesterday. It was more of a personal example where a friend of mine, her daughter keeps trying to remember I have they, them pronouns, but she will sometimes say she, her. And so my friend will say, oh, yes, like they, referring to me, like they do know how to play volleyball or whatever it is. And so that way it's not like being made to broadcast too loudly to accidentally embarrass the person or anything like that, put too much attention on the trans person. But you just continuously just show up and model. You can talk to that person individually and see if they would like to have additional support. Mm-hmm. If it does continue to happen that way, where they would like to have you step in. But, just watch, like maybe not do that until you ask permission, because there can again be the overzealous ally where the person's like, ooh, too much attention on me. Like I didn't really want to do it that way. So yeah, those are just a couple ideas of what you can do in that situation.
Okay, great. So are there some overall big mistakes you see therapists making that we want to especially be aware of?
Oof. Well, I do. I mean, honestly, it's that the fear and the self-doubt can really paralyze a therapist from being able to even start working with these clients, referring these clients out too soon, where, really checking in to say, okay, is this really just because I'm uncomfortable? Mm-hmm. Not because this person's trans. I just don't want to mess up, and I don't want to. That's a point of where more so sticking with your client, especially if you've known them for a while. And it turns out they're like, I can finally tell my therapist I'm trans. But being able to recognize that is a point where you need education or consultation to be able to move forward with that client. If the client would like to have a different therapist, then that's a different story. But be careful not to refer out too soon. If this client needs a higher level of care, such as needing letters of support because they're going to pursue gender-affirming surgeries, you can have a different therapist who knows how to write those letters and do those evaluations separately. You don't have to stop seeing the client. They can still be your client, and they can be seen for that. You can also learn how to do those as well. There's various options for that. But I would say that's one of the biggest things is in terms of your relationship with the client, don't be too hasty in terms of feeling like, oh no, I'm in over my head. Do your own research for the things that feel relevant But definitely don't hesitate to get to know your client as a specific person. And you can ask very open-ended questions like you would with anyone else. Like if you are on the topic of their transition, wow, that's amazing. Like, would you mind sharing with me your journey? Like what that was like for you? And then pick up on all the different words that they use to describe themselves and their body and things like that. And then you'll pick up on the language that you need to mirror back to them as well.
Yeah. And I'm thinking about times that I've sat with a client and all of a sudden something's like panicking me inside of me. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I don't know if I'm the right fit for this person. And just remembering to take a step back, and you don't have to make that decision right now. You don't have to make that decision by the end of the session. You can consult with colleagues, like you said, use your resources that are out there and find a way you can continue working with this client, because that's just, if you're doing it from your own place of fear, I feel like that's just one more way you're creating harm.
Yes. And the client will be able to sense that as well. So again, being your authentic self, but also remember you don't need to abandon your client right in that moment. Something else I'll mention too, so if you're really interested in working with this population, or you just find that you have a lot of clients who identify as trans, then it would be a great idea to go to the WPATH, which is World Professional Association for Transgender Health website, and they have the standards of care that you can download and get updated as to what are the different requirements when it comes to therapy and hormone use and surgeries, because those get updated continuously. And the worst thing is to not be aware of some changes. I'll give you the most dramatic shift that happened, which there might not be big dramatic changes in the future. I think the biggest one that might come up at some point is you don't need letters for surgery, let's say, for instance. So back in the day, it used to be where you had to go to therapy for a year before you could start hormone therapy. Like you had to see an actual therapist for that long just to make sure you really are this gender that you think you are, and the amount of money that would cost for one in time. And then it was like unsafe. Like people had to somehow perform this gender out in the world and perform this gender to their therapist so that they were convincing the therapist they could start hormone therapy. I saw clients for like 5 years after this was even changed in the standards of care who said, oh my gosh, I just left a therapist who I was stuck with because they said I couldn't get hormone therapy because I had to stay with them for a year. And that therapist did not know the standards of care had changed. And so I was like, oh dear, we can talk for 2 or 3 sessions and I can get you that letter. And then do you want to stay in therapy or not? That is up to you. That is your choice. And so being aware that there has been changes like this, there's been tremendous gatekeeping for this population. It goes way back in time. Your older trans clients are going to have a different experience and a lot more different traumas than your younger trans clients. Just continuing to be sensitive to that.
And so much of this is really following the lead of the client, presenting yourself as safe and open and sort of, obviously staying informed. We talked about that when we chatted before about the onus is on us to learn, not our clients. Back in the day before the internet, when I was in grad school, it was like, you told your clients, please teach me about that. But that's just not in today's world. Even probably back then, it's just not the right thing to do. We're responsible for our own learning.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. And I mean, honestly, there are a lot of options now in terms of these different, where places that you can experience this or take online classes. And I do offer a consultation as well. And so there's ways to do it. Like there really is. And it really won't take that long to feel like you could be ready to even just be like, you're already probably trans friendly if you're listening to this episode. To be more trans affirming, it just takes like a little bit more effort. And then trans knowledgeable would be like you're ready to write letters and support them through their legal transition and things like that. Again, that doesn't have to take a whole lot of time either, but you can imagine as these different tiers of experience, and you can experiment with how far you want to go with that as well.
Mm-hmm. Just being open to what are the resources out there. How does it hit with you? Does it fit well with the type of therapist you are, what your strengths are, what you have to offer? I think on-the-job training is one of the best things about this field, is that we tend to work with clients that have some sort of identity similar to our own. That can be a big ticket to burn out too. But it doesn't hurt to change up your specialties every now and then and say, okay, I've been working with this population for a while. Maybe I'm feeling a little burnt out. I know that we need more therapists who work with trans clients. So maybe this is something I want to explore. Maybe this would be the next step for me.
And it could be as simple as adding that to your Psychology Today profile. First of all, make sure they have it now where you can add your pronouns. So make sure you do that. Have your pronouns next to your name on your website or whatever that might look like. But from there, they have the little specialty areas you can check mark. I will say, don't check mark it in terms of it. I think there's different broad categories. I think they still have on there like gay, lesbian, bisexual, trans, but don't check it until you're ready and you're ready to follow through. And you feel like you are in that place of being, like I said, just aware enough to work with clients. And if someone does contact you, just be really upfront about your experience so far. And that way they can make that choice as well in terms of selecting you as a therapist too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point, because that checking one of those boxes can be really intimidating, because then like the client's going to come and expect that I know every single thing there is and I have years of experience. So being open about that is a good way to manage that, it sounds like.
Yeah, I have a YouTube channel that I used to post on a lot. And what I would suggest to clients, trans clients, like, how do you find an affirming therapist? And, we start off with like, let's take a look at their description of who they are. Are they using their pronouns? Are they using gender neutral language? And then it's like you can bring these interview questions with you and say, do you know what the WPATH standards of care are? And if at least now you heard this and you're like, I am aware of them, but I haven't read them yet.
Right.
But that person will be like, you know about them. That's actually, that is a check mark and, for a possibly yes for you in that you can say, but I can, or you can even say, I do have them. I just, and I can easily access them at any point. But, if the client's like, okay, I'm here to get support with transitioning, here, my letters support this, then you can explore that with them and say, I haven't yet worked with a client, to that level. But if you feel like we're a really good fit, I'm happy to get consultation as to how I can support you in that way. So just go ahead and think about that you can still, even though it might sound overwhelming, there is a path where you can be able to figure out how to do these things for the clients. And so we need more and more affirming therapists out there. And so again, it is maybe a fine line to figure out when you're ready to put yourself out there, but don't hesitate to put yourself out there, even as an affirming provider, even though there's going to be things you still need to be able to learn. You don't have to go into this perfect. Please don't. That'll never happen.
Yeah.
I struggle with perfectionism, so I was just projecting a little bit there.
No, I think so many therapists do, because when in graduate school, we're sort of taught that we have to know all the things and treat all the people and do, it's just like, and I hope that, I was in grad school in the 90s, so I'd hope that the newer clinicians coming up in grad school are learning that, okay, like, I don't go see a medical doctor who's a dermatologist to look at my foot. And as therapists, we also should and can say, I work best with these people. These are the people I'm going to work with. So being aware of that, I think, is really helpful.
Yeah, exactly. Like you're saying, like as part of the different populations I work with under my area of specialty, I do work with trans clients. And that means a certain something. And it doesn't mean you are therefore needing to be an expert as to how to help this person transition, for instance, or to navigate the medical side of things. That only if you want to explore all of that, do you need to do that. But it's okay. You don't have to take that on as well.
Mm-hmm. Okay. So the very baseline is we want to encourage therapists out there that whether or not you're looking to work with this specific population, it's a great idea and a very kind thing to do and very professional is to have at least a base level of understanding about pronouns and about all the different things we talked about today to make sure you're not creating harm. And so we can decide maybe a client's not a right fit for us, not because of our own fear, but for whatever their specific needs are. But yeah. All right. So Dara, this has been really helpful. I appreciate you coming on today. Are there any other things that you want to make sure that you leave the listeners with today?
Like I said, the fact that you're listening to this episode today really shows that you are interested and you're concerned and you want to help. And that means the world to me and means the world to all the potential clients you're going to work with who identify as trans and non-binary. And so, let's not minimize the impact that your interest and perhaps even your passion to work with this community, how far that can get you. And like we were just talking about, then take the time to do your research beforehand and then get to know your clients as individuals and learn as you go along as well, because we really do need you out there.
Mm-hmm. And people are people, that everyone wants to be treated kindly and with respect.
There you go.
Okay, so Dara, do you have a favorite catchphrase or analogy that you like to use that you can share with us?
I would say I identify as a Jungian, and so I'm really fond of the hero's journey. So as often as possible, I do try to incorporate that storyline sort of premise with clients and pretty much my friends and everybody in my life, where it's like, ooh, I wonder what the character of the story would do at this point. And if there's a particular movie or something like that that they can associate with, like really bring that metaphor in with them, like which character would they most identify with? I'll be honest, my book, which is called You and Your Gender Identity, A Guide to Discovery, is very much based on the hero's journey. And so it can be a really cool tool to use with those clients who you think could really connect with that, because this gender journey is very much a journey indeed.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Well, thank you for all the information you shared today. This is super helpful. I will put information in the show notes about how they can reach out to you. And for all the hardworking therapists out there, please remember our work is hard, but it doesn't have to be lonely.
Thank you so much for listening to the Colleague Down the Hall podcast. For show notes, links, and downloads, head over to colleaguedownthehall.com, where you'll be able to learn more about getting the clinical support you need and resources to help you work in a supported, sustainable way. If you've enjoyed this episode, please share with your therapy friends and colleagues. Subscribe to the podcast, and if you love this episode, please leave a review.